to tell you about something else that happened today because we think it tells you a lot about where this country is moving. When you were growing up, you probably learned one of the most basic moral principles that there is. You ought to treat other people as individuals for who they are, not on the basis of how they look or who their parents are, what their parents did. You ought to judge people for what they do and what they say, for the choices they make. That was a good principle. We haven't always followed it as individuals or as a country, but we ought to try to follow it as best we can, our hardest, because bigotry diminishes and hurts people. It's pretty simple. And yet somehow, over time, the institutional left has decided to reject that idea and embrace a standard that is both new and time-worn. You may have assumed that race guilt, collective punishment, moral purity based on bloodline, you thought those were discredited ideas, creepy relics of a darker time. It turns out they're not. It turns out the New York Times wholeheartedly embraces those ideas. So does much of the left. Yesterday, the Times announced it was hiring a woman called Sarah Jeong to write about technology for the paper. Within hours, readers discovered Jeong's Twitter feed, which she had not bothered to delete, apparently because she was not embarrassed by it. Judging by what she wrote on Twitter, Sarah Jeong is an angry bigot, and not in a subtle way. Here are some examples of her tweets. Quote, "Oh man, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men." Another, quote, "Dumbass effing white people marking up the internet with their opinions like dogs peeing on fire hydrants." Another, quote, "Hashtag cancel white people." At one point, Jeong tweeted a crude graph claiming that as whiteness increased, so did awful. Later, she said that white people smell like dogs. Here's another one, quote, "White people have stopped breeding. You'll all go extinct soon. That was my plan all along." And on and on. Well, people are getting fired for far less than this across corporate America right now, but the New York Times decided to double down on Sarah Jeong's behalf. Here's part of the statement the paper sent out about her, quote, "Jeong's journalism and the fact she is a young Asian woman have made her a subject of frequent online harassment. For a period of time, she responded to that harassment by imitating
Korean.
the
We love
rhetoric
Koreans
of her
here.
harassers. In other words, it's not her fault. White racism caused Sarah Jeong's racism against white people. She's the victim here, Harvard graduate, oppressed person that she is. Some of Jeong's many defenders in the press accuse her critics of taking
As a 24-year practitioner in Hapkido,
That's not true.
many Koreans
no
between then and now,
tweets.
I've known.
Sarah Jeong was furious at an
Very
entire race of people, and she said so on Twitter. You'd think somewhere on the left, the last responsible person would be
little subtle psychological, that something Tucker doesn't necessarily know, because he is kind of more white than the rest of
But
us.
modern progressives are happy not simply to defend it, but to attack anyone
Even though we're still
who
white.
questions the joy that Sarah
Asian
Jeong
woman.
from being
No, she's
called white.
Korean.
Lydia Paul Green, the editor-in-chief of HuffPo,
He wouldn't know that, but I'm pointing
by
out.
her peers as a moron, announced that criticism of Jeong is, quote, part of a deeply troubling trend of far-right agitators trying to get journalists fired. Far-right agitators, okay. To see, though, is some honesty. Let's all stop lying for a minute. What Sarah Jeong said was wrong, but it was only shocking because she expressed it so clearly. In point of fact, her views are commonplace in the American establishment, maybe universal. Try to find a single government bureaucrat or college administrator or head of corporate HR who disagrees with the idea that people should be judged by the color of their skin and that some races are more virtuous and deserving than other races.
Groups,
They all
ethnicities
Every one of
in the human race.
And yet,
look, I'm going to train you all. You got to stop using this term
to
racism.
cry racism
Human race.
at the slightest provocation.
You know,
no reason
to
at all.
refer to different
They
ethnic
think of
groups.
themselves as arch enemies of racism. They get tattoos on their arm telling you that, and yet they're its chief purveyors. Deep, deep irony. How do they do that? Well, simple. They redefine the term. As Vice.com succinctly put it,
Should be the term.
Quote,
No, we're
it's
going.
literally impossible.
It's not even the right
to a white
term.
person. Pretty much the entire left now takes that as a matter of faith. They deeply believe that. But what does that mean exactly? Is there really an entire race of people so repulsive, so morally repugnant that it is, quote, literally impossible to wrong them? You could do anything to people like that and not feel bad about it. In fact, why wouldn't you? They deserve it. They're not really human.
You just heard it right. They're not really human. Well, the human race. Exactly. The anachronistic language of the 1960s, 50s, leading to the civil rights movement. We're all the human race of different ethnic groups. Well, I'm a little disappointed that the write-up center types are falling into what the anachronistic language that the left has been, because they keep hearing it, has been using, pull it back. Left has been using for quite some time now. Now they're using it. People of color, racism, da-da-da-da. Come on, Tucker, wake it up, dude.
Appreciate him. We want information, and that particular network is failing because they do not provide it. This network survives and does well because Americans of all stripes know they're going to get the information they need to live their day and to know what tomorrow will look like. That's our job.
You're hired.
Thank you. It was easy.
I've got more for you. Hold on.
All right.
The New York Times defends the hiring of their new tech writer, Sarah Jeong. Now, she has a history of posting racist and ugly texts. Look at this one for a start. Oh man, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men.
Lovely.
I open my mouth to politely greet a Republican, but nothing but an unending cascade of vomit flows from my face. Now, they've hired this lady, despite those tweets or texts, whatever it was, but they actually fired another tech writer, I think, who made nasty comments about gays.
Yes.
What's going on?
So that was another woman, another tech writer in February, who they had hired to do the same sort of job, but then fired when older tweets of hers came out as well. The difference is between the two is that first writer, and dealing with issues regarding African Americans and gays, had offended progressives. That was that problem. In this case, you're looking at a young woman who actually I think will fit in quite well with the New York Times, who has a history on their editorial and opinion page of racialist editorials. Questions about, can my children ever be friends with white people? That's an actual headline. Charles Blow writing about the white extinction fear amongst white people. It's very racialist. It's a framework that really seems to me to seek to create some kind of division and resentment between the races. And so
the ethnicities, the ethnic
She's
groups.
arguing, though, that her tweets
Look, I'm the only one on media you're going to hear this from.
Racist to her.
It's like enough of
so
this racism
blaming
talk.
the
human race,
her own
right?
tweets. And the New York
Subdivide
Times
into many
that in their
ethnic
statement,
groups.
reiterated that effectively.
Ethnicities.
But remember the job she's going to get. She's taking on an editorial board position, which means there'll be no bylines. And I think people...
And she's going to go down in flames. I'll see to that.
Realm so that we can push against them. In this case, suddenly it will be anonymous. And it will be effectively couched in the cloak of what you get with the anonymous editorials.
Well, New Hampshire is a pretty remarkable state. You'll know that if you've been there. One of the prettiest places on the continent. Granite mountains, deep forests, clean water. The people are impressive, too. The kids in New Hampshire get some of the highest SAT scores in the country. And it's safe. The crime rate in New Hampshire is just a fraction of that in other states. A lot of people in New Hampshire have guns, and yet the homicide rate is less than 1/10 the rate in Washington, D.C. Very few New Hampshire residents are in prison. It's got one of the country's lowest incarceration rates. Most of them are working. The state has one of America's lowest unemployment rates. In contrast to places like Illinois, New Hampshire is gaining population. People want to live there, not surprisingly. And yet, according to the New York Times, New Hampshire needs to change desperately and immediately. Why is that? Well, in a story over the weekend, the Times explained that New Hampshire is, quote, nearly all white, 94%, and this has caused, quote, an array of problems. The paper doesn't prove that this is true. In fact, there's zero evidence that the demographics of the state hurt the people who live there. New Hampshire's actual problems, and it has some, have nothing to do with race at all. Instead, though, the Times argues that New Hampshire's whiteness is inherently offensive to others, especially immigrants. The paper interviewed a woman from Columbia who complained that she cannot find enough Spanish speakers in New Hampshire, and that is unacceptable. According to the New York Times, Americans have an obligation to change their culture to suit foreigners and not the other way around. But more than anything, the paper says, the state must become less white quickly, like the rest of the country. Its current demographics
POLIT'AI CHI is
group of self-appointed officials and business leaders
every once in a while
to change the racial makeup of New Hampshire right now.
And that's not what they
Thank God, says the
That's
Times.
imperative.
What's so striking about this story is how ordinary it is. You hear things like this all the time from liberal outlets. Some races are better than others, they claim. Some are just plain awful. Well, that's pure racism, of course. It's the very definition of racism. But it's so ubiquitous on the left that hardly anybody notices it or questions it. You're not allowed to, by the way. Your job is just to nod in bovine agreement. Yes, diversity is our strength. But nobody should agree to that. It's wrong, and it's dangerous. Attitudes like this will destroy our country faster than anthrax and Al-Qaeda combined. Racism is poison. Let's be clear so that even the bigots of the New York Times can understand. No race is inherently better than any other race. There can't be too many of any group. Are there too many Chinese in Beijing, too many Africans in Congo? Of course not. Those are stupid questions. The same is true for the people of New Hampshire, many of whose families have been there for hundreds of years. There is nothing wrong with the way they look. They're not defective or inadequate because of their skin color. It's amazing you even have to say that. But nobody is defective or inadequate because of his or her skin color. All of us should remember that and demand that our leaders remember it too. Many have forgotten it.